All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here on time. This is about common formative assessment. So, give you a little background. I was at a meeting. I'm a teacher partner is my title, and every building in our district has a me at their building. And twice a month we have afternoon meetings. What they asked us to talk about, start talking about to our staffs, are common formative assessments. So how are we setting goals for our students' learning, and how are we assessing them and talking about PLCs? So we're going to be working more with Marzano Research Laboratory about developing practices in PLCs, and my guess would be that common formative assessment will be one of the things that we will be doing. So if you were here last year, think about how we used to do the essay cycles. That is an example of common formative assessment. We got together and we said, what content are we teaching? What's a good way to assess it via writing? And then creating a common rubric, and then getting together and being able to say, all right, what was our proficiency levels, and reporting that back out. So we did this last year already, and we're going to be kind of coming back to it. A little more flexibility, probably doesn't have to be essays this time, so people are going to have their own kind of ways to do it, and I'll show you some examples of it here. So speaking of common formative assessments, you guys do a quick turn and talk your table. What do we think it is? What do we think a common formative assessment is? Take about 2 minutes. The person who's been teaching the longest at your table should start the conversation. So, common formative assessments. What are our guesses? What do we think this means? Ariel, thanks for volunteering. What do you think it means?
It's an assessment that can be used across all of the same classes, or throughout the same grade or the same month.
So same classes. So that would be like within your PLC probably? Yeah. And then potentially even across content, across grade levels and across content levels? Yeah, potentially, absolutely. For our purposes, we are going to kind of keep it focused. We are going to be talking about PLCs. So we're going to be developing these as common formative assessments within our PLC groups. So a lot of our PLCs are grade and content based. So 9th grade English, 10th grade US History, 9th grade GI. So same classes or the same PLC. Yeah, so it could be daily. These ones we're talking about are kind of what you were saying at the end there. So the purpose of these is to inform your instruction, just like you were saying. So that's, when we talk about formative assessment, it's using assessments that informs our instruction. So that could be day of, like, checks for understanding throughout your lesson to make sure that you don't have to go back and reteach. Or it could be larger assignments that you use across your PLC to kind of evaluate and align your instruction, your assessments, your proficiency, and the outcomes. Okay, so we'll have an opportunity to read about that here in just a second. So on the front page of your packet, titled "Why Should We Use Common Assessments?" Take a moment, read through this, make some annotations about something that you've learned about common assessments, and why they might be something that we would want to take on here at Aurora Central. What are we noticing? Common assessments. I mean, I like the identify essential and valued student learning. Like, that's why we build our scales, right? To develop, to come to a common understanding of what the most important content is for our students to learn. So for a pro, I'm going to put identify important content. Absolutely. Then after we identify that important content, what does that second paragraph tells us comes next? Achievement goals. I'm going to go with what Schmoker tells us here and say, develop how we're going to assess this important content. And this is kind of the crux of what we're talking about today. We have scales where we've decided what the most important content is for our group, for our PLC to be teaching. And then the next step, potentially, is to develop a way to assess that our students have that content. Now, the difference between a summative and a formative, would be that we teach. 6 weeks later, we assess. We find out the students didn't get it. The common formative assessments allow us to, within that 6-week time period, assess multiple times across the grade level to be able to come together and talk about what content are the students understanding and what content aren't they understanding. I like how in the second paragraph from the bottom, they write, instead it took getting some grade level teacher teams to meet analyze the results of interim assessments to understand what concepts in the curriculum, so what content of the curriculum aren't students getting or might not be as important, we're posing difficulty for students, share ideas and figure out interventions, and actually follow up in the classroom. So if we're noticing something common across our PLC, what interventions are we going to put in place to actually go back and be able to reteach? So that as opposed to at the end of 6 weeks, having to go back and reteach, if you're doing this throughout weekly, bi-weekly, you have a smaller chunk of instruction that you know you have to go back to.
My own experience, this seems like meeting with other teachers and figuring out common assessments is sucking time out of your life. But if you're truly in a PLC, wow, this saves you a ton of time because other people are making chunks of this and you're just doing it. And so it like makes you, I'm not saying I'm lazy, but I'm saying that a PLC is where it's at.
Yeah.
Because you did that chunk, and I just taught it.
Yeah. There's so much for us to do. I don't think there's anyone in the world that would dispute that we do not have enough time to do all the stuff that we need to do. And in a high-functioning PLC, I mean, I've seen it a lot. And the PLCs that are the most high-functioning, they save each other so much time by working together and developing these assessments together. And our hope is that as we move along and we get support not only from MRL, but from our district, that this is the way we want to move, that we will be getting some more specific direction about how we can create these PLCs and how we can make them a little bit more high functioning. And this is kind of our first step in that today, to kind of help consolidate what the work of a PLC actually is. Any questions on what common formative assessment actually is at this point? Okay, so I have an example of how the PLC that I work with every day in the class that I teach first period with Sean O'Malley that I co-teach, how we've used our PLC to create common formative assessments based off of the proficiency scales that we've built already. So in your packet here, if you flip over to page 2, you can see the scales that we developed for 10th grade English. So this is ELD, Co-op, Gen Ed, Honors. It is not sheltered. We do not have a sheltered group person in our PLC. So the scale that we're going to be talking about specifically today is the argument analysis scale. So this is, we spend time reading arguments and analyzing arguments, and then we move on to actually having the students writing the arguments in the second half of the quarter. So we're going to talk specifically about the argument analysis scale today. So what we decided to do as a PLC was that we wanted some learning objectives that could span across a certain amount of time. So what we did was we wrote learning objectives for our 2.0 content, our 2.5 level content, and our 3.0 content. So for example, our 2.0 content learning objective was up for about a week and a half. Now we had daily success criteria that we would say, all right, here's how we're building to get to this learning objective that we changed almost every day. But this learning objective stayed up for about a week and a half until we determined that our kids were proficient at this topic. So if we look at the 2.0 part of our scale, it's all about identification. Can the kids identify these terms by using these processes, and can they identify how authors use them in a text? So the first learning objective is I can identify the issue, perspective, audience, and purpose of a text in order to analyze the argument. So that first verb is identify. And you guys have been hearing a lot this year about the depth of knowledge and how we can use the depth of knowledge in our learning objectives to create more rigor in our classroom, or how to build using depth of knowledge. So the depth of knowledge verb for our 2.0 scale is simple. It's identify. That's basically a level 1. There's 4 levels. Identify generally is in level 1 content. So all we're asking kids to do is read and find these things. So what we need here, though, is we need a way to assess this. And we want a way to assess this learning objective across the grade level. So what we did was we developed a graphic organizer, which is on the next page. We read a text. We modeled for the students how to find the issue, perspective, position, audience, purpose, how to identify an author's claims, and how to identify an author's evidence. We modeled this. We had students practice it a couple of times. And then after they had, I think they read 2 articles, they did this, and we said, all right, they're identifying well at this point across the grade level, ELD to honors. Let's see if they can write about this a little bit. So writing about it is going to be our kind of level 2.5 content. And that is our next learning objective here. I can analyze the claims and evidence provided to support an argument. So Ms. Barber, what's the verb in this, the depth of knowledge verb that you see here? It's supposed to identify, it is? Analyze. It is analyze. So analyze is either a level 2 or level 3 in depth of knowledge, kind of depending on what you're having students do with analyzing. So what we decided was that if they could identify and put it into a graphic organizer, being able to write that information in a cohesive paragraph, that would be about level 2.5. Because we aren't asking them to evaluate yet, which is where we want to get, but writing about their identification allows them to analyze what the author is actually doing. So we wanted to find a way to assess this as well. This learning objective lasted about a week. So the way we were assessing this learning objective, if you want to flip over to page 4, we had the students write a rhetorical summary or an objective summary, basically. So we said, take all this information you've identified in your graphic organizer, and let's write a complete response in this format, showing us that you can analyze. Now, this is definitely supported, right? We see sentence frames here, but we felt like this support was totally appropriate because they hadn't done this before. We felt like, we can still assess their ability to write about this because the support wasn't so much that they don't have to do any thinking. They still have to show us the identification. They still have to show cohesion in their thinking. So what we did here was we wanted to track this. So finally we said, all right, we felt pretty confident in the beginning that they would be able to identify, but we weren't totally confident that they would be able to write about what they've identified in any form of analysis. So we started having students track their scores on this based on our scale. So what we decided was that, based on our scale, was that if students could identify and analyze this level 2.0 content, that would be a 2.5. That'd be a good way to get a 2.5. So what we did was we said a 2.5 for this assessment was proficient, okay? So you can see we did this twice, so objective summary number 1 and objective summary number 2. Objective summary number 1, only 5% of our kids were proficient. We said, okay, only 5% of our kids in period 1 scored a 2.5. They were also to 2.0. So we said, wow, even though we gave them this support, they still struggled. So we practiced it a little bit more. We taught the structure of the paragraph a little bit more. And then for the next text, the next article, we had them try it out, and it bumped up to 35% of our kids were able to get a 2.5. And we started hearing students evaluating the argument themselves. Like, well, yeah, that's his position, mister, but his position's not very good. Like, I don't agree with what he's saying. So once we started hearing kids talk about that, we said, these guys might be ready to start on their evaluation. So we wanted to start trying out the 3.0 content. So we can see our learning objective for our 3.0 content here. Dan, can you read that for us?
Yeah. Evaluate the effectiveness of an argument by analyzing the structure of the argument and the ideas presented within the argument.
So Ariel, what's the depth of knowledge verb in our third learning objective? Evaluate. And this is basically a level 4. This is as high as you go. You can evaluate and provide support for why you think that's true. So I could say, this person is right, I agree with their argument, or their argument's okay, but the structure's terrible. So they can evaluate it and say why they think that. So we are ready to move on to this third learning objective to see what we could do. So again, we wanted to provide some support because this was something our students had never done before. So what we did was we wrote an example. We wrote a proficient example of what we wanted to see. We used one of the texts that they had written an objective summary on so that they knew what we were writing about. And we went ahead and we evaluated the text. So what we said was, you can evaluate the structure by saying, is his position logical? Does he have claims that support his position? And does the evidence he have effectively support his claims? So that's how we asked them to evaluate the structure. And then finally, we said you will defend, refute, or qualify this argument, and that's how you will evaluate the author's ideas. So basically, you'd be able to say, some of his ideas are valid, but I think about it this way. Or his ideas are totally invalid, even though he attempts to support them with his structure, I completely disagree, or I completely agree with him. So they're evaluating structure, and they're evaluating his ideas, basically. So we gave him this proficient example, and then we asked them to write an evaluation on another text. And we can see here, for evaluation number 1, 55% of our kids were proficient. And then for evaluation number 4, 73% of our kids were proficient. So we definitely started seeing growth, but, and I'll show you guys this in a minute, our goal was that we would have kids, 90% of our kids being proficient. This being an honors class, based on like what we had learned about the kids before, and based on the scores that they had come in with on their state assessments, we thought 90% would be a very reasonable spot to be. So as you guys can see, we aren't there yet. So we were hoping to only write 2 evaluations and be able to move on into writing their own arguments, but we decided that since we didn't hit our mark, we wanted to try it a 3rd time and reteach. So for the sake of time, you guys can see that we broke down each learning objective and we evaluated here. Now this is something that we have up in our classroom for each period so that the kids can know where we're going. And I'm going to show you guys in a minute that we wrote our SMART goal for 90% so that they know we are not going to stop doing this until we get 90% proficiency. So that's the idea, is that not only will 1st period know where they are, but they'll be able to see 5th period. Well, 5th period already got there and they're moving on, we want to move on. I think, that little kind of friendly competition is pretty valuable for our kids sometimes. They get into that. But I think what else is important is what I'm going to talk about next, and that's students tracking their own learning. And I showed this to the whole staff not long ago. So it's the next page in your packet. There's a blank student tracker on there in case you wanted it and needed another copy. And then there is a completed student version. Alejandra Valenzuela, who's an absolutely fantastic student. This is her tracking her own learning just as we do over here. So what we do is every time we plot a point for our whole class, they take their tracker out and plot the same point for themselves. So Alejandra herself got 2.5s on the objective summaries. She got a 3 on her first evaluation, then a 3.5 on her second evaluation. So, and she's a fantastic student. So her growth, she wants to get a 4 obviously. So this next evaluation, she's gonna have an opportunity to get a 4. So it's tied to both the class and to the student. So we think it's really valuable that students are owning their own learning. I mean, this even works for kids with missing assignments. I can pull this out, ask them to pull this out, and they don't have anything plotted for C. I can say, well, why don't you have C in? Oh, Mr. I got it half done, but I didn't turn it in. We hear that all the time. So, all right, well, come to tutoring, come to lunch, let's get it done and get it in. So it's a really good way for them to own their own learning as well, become a little bit more responsible for themselves. Yes, it takes time in class to do this, but I think it takes probably less time to do this than it does to hound 120 kids, every week to turn their stuff in. Now that you guys can kind of see the process, what I would like to do is for you guys to take an opportunity to create your own learning objectives based off of your scales. So what I'd like you to do is get together with your PLC if you're here with the PLC. Look at your 2.0 content and think about what would be a learning objective that would fit for our 2.0 content. Would we use identify? Do we want them to do more than identify at 2.0? What do we want to do? At 2.5, are we asking for analysis? Are we asking for writing? What do we want as 2.5 content? And then 3.0 and above, creating a learning objective for that. With keeping in mind that we're trying to increase the rigor by moving up on the levels of our depth of knowledge chart. Any questions on what we're going to do? So writing learning objectives for level 2, 2.5, and 3.0 level content. That's what we're going to do until we're out of here. And I'm going to have a little bit of a feedback form for you guys as well to fill out for before you go, if you don't mind. Any questions on what you're working on?